In lecture 2 of our optional module, we're going to start to build the supply and demand curve for labor. And so we're going to start off with the demand for labor. And just a reminder, when we're thinking about the demand for labor, we're talking about the same idea of the product demand, but buyers who are now businesses. Businesses are the purchasers of labor. They're the ones that are going into the market and demanding labor. They're consuming the labor that us as households supply. And when we're thinking about labor demand, it's the curve that's going to show us the amount of labor that buyers are willing and able to purchase at all the different price levels. Okay, it's going to look very similar to our demand when we're looking at the market level. We have that downward sloping demand curve. We're assuming that perfectly competitive market. But what's different between our demand, our labor demand, and product demand is that we consider labor demand and actually all resource demand. So any of our factors of production, we're talking about the demand for land or the demand for capital or the demand for entrepreneurial ability. It would all be considered derived demand. And what that means is the demand for the resource depends on how much demand there is for the product it produces. So we can think about something, we can think about it in terms of, okay, so if something is in high demand, if people want to consume a lot of them, so something like Apple products, so the iPhone, the Mac, the iPads, there's a lot of demand for those products. And therefore, the people who produce, the software engineers that produce that product, there's a lot of demand for their labor. And that's dependent on the demand for those products. So if all of a sudden we decided we don't want any more Apple products, the demand for some of that labor would start to disappear. And that's going to occur in every resource market, not just the labor markets. That's important to remember. But what we're going to talk about in reference to is labor demand. So let's just think of this again. So this is a software engineer, and you and I, we don't really demand his labor, right? We don't demand, I don't know, I'm not going to pay you your $50 an hour wage or whatever it is. I don't have any demand for your labor, but I do demand a new Fitbit, right? I got my new Fitbit. And so I do demand the Fitbit. I don't demand that individual's labor, but as I demand more Fitbits, that's going to increase the quantity that's bought and sold in the market. So we can see an increase in demand, a shift from D1 to D2 is going to increase the quantity bought and sold in the market from Q1 to Q2. And as we increase the quantity that's bought and sold in the market, we need more production. And to produce more, that means we need more of those software engineers. So as we demand more of one good, we're also then in turn going to demand more of the labor that's required to produce that good, more of the land that's required to produce that good, more of the capital, more of the entrepreneurial ability that's all used to produce that good. And so it's going to be important to remember that our resource market is actually derived from the product market. Without the product market, there would be no demand for those resources. All right, so the derived demand is going to depend on how productive our labor is. So when we're thinking about the labor market, how productive is this input? How much output can this individual or this resource produce? And also the product price. And again, when we look at our example here, we see that increase in demand drove up the equilibrium price, and that's going to encourage sellers to supply more. As they supply more, they need more workers to produce it. And so the demand for labor is not only going to depend on how productive our workers can be, but also the product price. It's going to be derived from that product market. So what changes the labor demand? So what can cause a shift in the labor demand curve? And so what we see is a change in the product's demand. So as the product demand changes, it's going to change the demand for labor. Changes in productivity. So if our workers become more productive, if there's a new technology, or if our workers become more efficient, that's going to shift our labor demand curve. And then also the prices of other resources. And this is kind of an interesting one. And so one of the ways that prices of other resources can affect labor demand is if these products are substitute resources. So we can think about something like digging a ditch. And I can either hire workers to dig a ditch, or I can get a piece of equipment, machinery, to dig that ditch. If labor is relatively inexpensive, then I'm just going to hire workers to dig that ditch. But if labor starts to increase in price, or that piece of equipment starts to decrease in price, all of a sudden I may decide to shift my production to using capital like that machinery rather than using labor. And so it could be that there's substitute resources. If the price of a substitute resource increases, then we're going to see an increase in that demand for labor. But if that substitute resource decreases in price, so if it's cheaper to buy a piece of equipment that could replace my workers, then I'm going to have a decrease in my labor demand. What we also see is the reverse. There are complementary resources, resources that work together. And so let's stick with our digging ditch example. And as labor becomes less, let's go with labor becoming less expensive. As labor becomes less expensive relative to that big piece of equipment, I'm going to have to purchase more shovels. And so my worker and my shovel are complementary resources. And so they're going to have to work together. If I'm using more labor, then I'm also going to demand more shovels. And so we have complementary resources and substitute resources. If they're substitute, then an increase in the price of one resource will cause an increase in the demand for the other resource, because I'm going to move away from the more expensive way to produce my good. If they're complementary, the reverse is going to be true. An increase in the price of one resource is going to decrease the demand in that complementary resource. If labor becomes more expensive, I use fewer shovels, but I'll purchase that piece of equipment to do the work for me. Okay, so changes in the product demand. As we demand more of a product, then we need more workers to produce that product. Changes in productivity. As our workers become more productive, then we're going to increase our demand for that worker. And then those price of those other resources. All right, so that was a background into the demand side of our labor. Again, remember, when you're thinking about the demand for labor, it's no longer households that are doing the demanding. It's going to be businesses. Businesses demand labor. All right, next we're going to move on to supply and the equilibrium. So as we move from demand to supply, remember, who supplies labor?